Good evening. We hope tonight to bring you an important and insightful discussion about a topic that gets a lot of coverage but not enough in-depth analysis. The American war in Iraq is the largest, most dramatic foreign policy undertaking of a generation. There have been well over 100,000 U.S. troops in that country for longer than our entire involvement in World War II. And it is a central debate in a dynamic presidential race. Already journalists, foreign policy experts, and military analysts are placing the war in a time frame with broad historical headings: the invasion, the uprising, the Civil War, the surge. But the reality on the ground was and remains much more fluid. Our hope for tonight is to disentangle at least some of the talking points that have dominated the domestic side of the Iraq debate and try to square them with the complexities as they exist in the theater. And to help us do that, we are honored by three special guests. Anne Gilroy served in Iraq, attaining the rank of captain in the U.S. Marines. She is a graduate of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and Harvard Business School. She first deployed to Iraq in 2004 and has served nearly 2 years there, most of the time also as Special Assistant to General David Petraeus. We profiled on this broadcast some of Captain Gilroy's efforts in southern Iraq around the 5th anniversary of the start of the war. Ms. Gilroy has recently begun working for Goldman Sachs. Thank you for being with us. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Seth Moulton graduated from Harvard University with a degree in physics in 2001 and then served 4 combat tours in Iraq. Mr. Moulton commanded Marine infantry platoons during the invasion and the 2004 Battle of Najaf. He then volunteered for his 3rd and 4th tours, where he worked as a special assistant to General David Petraeus. Mr. Moulton has now returned to civilian life and is returning to Harvard this fall to begin graduate studies in business and government. He continues to serve as a captain in the U.S. Marine Reserves. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you.
Moulton and Gilroy, along with Sergeant Alex Lemons, who could not be here tonight, served with each other as part of a special unit dubbed Team Phoenix. The team was tasked with training, aiding, and facilitating coalition and Iraqi Army units to put into practice the counterinsurgency programs championed by General Petraeus. We are also joined by a friend and colleague, Lucian Reed, an award-winning photojournalist who has reported for this broadcast as well. He has spent 2 years in Iraq since the start of the war, covering operations and units across the country. His coverage of the Second Battle of Fallujah and the Marine unit involved in the civilian deaths in Haditha, Iraq in 2005 earned him critical acclaim. Reed saw firsthand the rise of the Sunni awakening in Al-Anbar province and the deployment of the brigades who constituted the surge. He has known and covered Captains Moulton and Gilroy since 2004. You will see some of Lucian's photographic work throughout tonight's discussion. Lucian, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, let's get started. First of all, Ms. Gilroy, tell me how you got into the service and what you did when you got there.
Well, my journey into service was fairly difficult. I started doing investment banking here in New York, and I decided that because of my graduate degree, I wanted to go and do something to pay service to the nation.
And your journey in Iraq, what did you do when you were there?
Well, I arrived in the summer of 2004, and at that point it was really for me to define. The military at our ranks hadn't started focusing on who are the Iraqi security forces, how do we build them, and especially in our unit because the Marines were very busy fighting in Najaf. So I started working with them to try to help them construct their units. At that time, we had a 60% desertion rate in the Iraqi security forces. They had 5 rounds of ammo per magazine. So there were really many obstacles that we faced in just even building up one unit. So that was the original job that I had, and it blossomed into many other things, actually.
Well, Mr. Moulton, tell me how you got into the service, why you got in, and what you did once you were there.
You know, I've just always thought it's a very important job, and I have an awful lot of respect for especially the 18 and 19-year-olds who really stand on the front lines and bear the brunt of the burden of wars like this for the nation. And I decided that I wanted to do my part too after college. So I looked at some different service options. I looked at teaching, I looked at AmeriCorps and the Peace Corps, but I decided that if I was up for the challenge, the Marine Corps would be it. I very much wanted to be in the infantry, and I was able to get that, which was actually challenging at the time in the Marine Corps.
Infantry combat platoon.
Yes, sir, exactly. And then we were part of the invasion. And we fought our way up to Baghdad. We were in Baghdad, one of the first Marine units in the city. And then after the major fighting was over, and in a sense victory was declared, there really was no plan. We had no idea what they were going to do with us. They actually told us we would be getting on the ships and going home within a few weeks. But as it turned out, we went down to Hilla, which is a town about an hour south of Baghdad, and we started working there on the reconstruction. That was my first deployment. In 2004, I returned with another platoon and fought in the Battle of Najaf. On the ship ride on the way over, my Marines asked me what it would be like. And I said it really could be two extremes. It could be really brutal fighting, or it could be an awful lot of reconstruction. I really thought it would be the latter. Instead, within 5 days of our arrival, it was some of the worst fighting that had been seen till that point in Iraq and in the war. And then at the end of the month, when the fighting was over, we turned to training the new Iraqi army. And that's how I got to know Anne, because she was providing absolutely critical support to the units that we were training and doing missions with. And that's how I then got to be known by General Petraeus and get to work for him.
And your third tour?
That was with Anne in 2005. We worked together on Team Phoenix when General Petraeus was the commanding general of MNSTICI, the Multinational Security Transition Force. They're in charge of training, equipping, and organizing all the Iraqi security forces. And he used us as problem solvers to go out in areas with limited coalition presence and do some training, build police stations, border forts, and army bases, and solve political problems for him where he didn't have other resources to do so. In 2006, I got out and applied to graduate school, very much intending to go down a different path. And then when General Petraeus got the new job in 2007, I told him that I would be willing to go back, and he asked me to come. And so got talking to Anne, and we came up with doing Team Phoenix again, and then we all deployed in July of 2007 to work for General Petraeus again.
And Lucian, how did you get to Iraq? Had you been there before the hostilities following 9/11 happened?
No, I first went, I guess, actually with these two. That's how I met them, was on the ship ride over in 2004, summer of 2004. And initially I went over there with the idea of doing a whole deployment with Seth's unit and then a book out of that. So I left with them and was there. That first trip was about 9 months, but I've been back, I guess, 6 times since then, the last mostly with these guys in January and February of this year.
All of those times as a combat photographer?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I've done a little other work here or there, infantry units, a little bit of medical work, but usually out on the street, sure.
But Lucian Reed, through his compelling photographs, has not only covered American troops. He has documented what is said to be the growing strength of the Iraqi security forces and the rise of the, quote, awakening. That is where local Iraqi tribal sheikhs have fought insurgents with cash, other financial aid, and logistical support from the American military. Well, let's talk about this in some sections. First, what I'll call the rise of the awakening. Where did it come from, and why was it so long in coming?
Are you talking about in the South or in the West?
Well, let's talk about that. There's a difference.
There's a big difference. In the South, you have a history in the tribal structure that's been very fractured for decades now under Saddam Hussein. People have to understand that Saddam, too, had to win the favor of the tribes, and he did that largely by deciding which tribes he needed to pay off in order for them to be complicit in dealing with him. That created a very, very fractured tribal system in the South. So when the United States went into Iraq, I think that we thought, oh, we're establishing a legitimate government. We're going to establish a democracy. Inside of democracy, there's no such thing as a feudal tribal system. And so from the start in the South, we were unaware that we were actually not doing our best to be inclusive or to bring in a system that had existed for many years in Iraq. And we didn't really have a method to reach out to them. In fact, the method we had put in place cut them out because the governors in the South who ran for the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, who won in 2005, they had just returned to Iraq at the fall of Baghdad in 2003. So people need to understand that most of the people now governing the South came over from Iran and had spent about 15 years there post the Iran-Iraq War. So once the elections occurred, they were excluded in a very large way because the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq knew that they could be a populist threat and therefore takes actions actually on a daily basis to ensure that they remain suppressed. Until the tribal awakening occurred in the West, we did not see this movement begin to start. And that was really a catalyst for the sheikhs in the South to say, wait a minute, we're tired of being oppressed. We need a peace in this government too. And I really believe that sometimes we look at it and we say, oh, well, we can't just maintain a tribal system in Iraq. Well, we don't want to, but if we offer them a way or an avenue to come in and participate in a legitimate government, then it's much better for the people because you've incorporated them in a system and they take care of the people that they come from, unlike the governments that have been placed on top of them at this time.
Well, let's move to the west.
Sure.
El Anbar, to the west of Baghdad. That's where what's called the awakening began.
Right, and you ask why it took so long. I think there were two major issues. One is that we really, as a U.S. military, just did not appreciate the depth of tribalism in the country. I mean, look, when I was headed over there as a platoon commander for the invasion, I was reading a State Department handbook on Iraq while I was flying in a helicopter into Kuwait, and that pretty much constituted my education on the country. Now, the military has changed dramatically, and we do a much better job, at least, of really teaching soldiers and Marines about Iraq before we go there. So it took some time for that to develop, though. And so I think when we first got there in 2003, and even in early 2004, we really didn't appreciate how important tribes were to the Iraqi culture.
How can that be? That Iraq has a long history, even pre-biblical times. It's no secret what the culture of the country was and is. Was it your impression, is it your opinion, that it was just the military that didn't understand the history and culture of the country, or was it the civilian control of the military as well?
I think it was both. Really, the entire U.S. government, quite frankly, was very naive in how we went into Iraq. And I was just a second lieutenant, but I think that a part of me, at least, shared in that naivete and thought that if we simply toppled Saddam, all these old parts of Iraq would, in a sense, kind of go away in favor of democracy.
Which they didn't do.
And that didn't happen. That's right. That's right. I mean, Iraqis, at a very fundamental level, I think, first of all, just don't even really understand democracy. And so it takes a while to teach that.
Well, what happened, what changed, and when did it happen and change in that territory to the west?
So there were two things that went on. First, the military, and to some degree the State Department, but I think it was primarily the military and the Marine Corps especially, woke up and started realizing that we have to start engaging and working with these tribal leaders to help fight our common enemy, Al-Qaeda. And that took a while to occur. But that started probably in about 2005, where we were making concerted efforts to get with local sheikhs and try to bring them over to our side. At the same time, the tribes themselves were starting to realize that these Al-Qaeda folks who had come in were really not good for them. As much as they tried to ally with the local people, they were really causing more harm than good. And so they started shifting in their allegiance and started having much more interest in working with the Americans. But I don't think it was really until 2006 when Al-Qaeda really went over the line in being just absolutely brutal with the local populace and therefore turned a lot of the locals against them, a lot of the tribes against them, at the same time as the U.S. was really emphasizing the importance of spreading out the troops in small patrol bases where they could interact closely with the Iraqi people. So what that meant is that when a tribal leader decided to align himself with the U.S. and throw his lot in with the coalition, there were U.S. troops living around the corner, living in the next block, who could help his people if they had the courage to stand up against Al-Qaeda. And when we were confined to large bases and we weren't in these small joint security stations, we weren't able to do that.
So that was a major change. And you, as you describe it, correct me if I'm wrong, was really the basis of the awakening, if you will, to get out of the fixed base syndrome and go to the smaller unit out amongst them. Lucian, you nodded your head in agreement about one thing before.
I was just recalling, I had a conversation with one of the sheikhs in Ramadi that was just talking about how everybody he knew had had a brother or an uncle or a cousin or a grandfather murdered by Al-Qaeda or people from, related to Al-Qaeda at one point or the other, and that initially they supported those guys, but every time there was some sort of disagreement, somebody would be assassinated, just sort of taken out in the desert and disappeared. And after whatever 3 years of that or something, they just had enough. And so our tactics were very important in a positive way, but Al-Qaeda, I think, sort of overstepped. They made errors that had nothing to do with us that really cost them the support there. And I think that was really, for my money, that's really what started it.
Well, very quickly, when we talk about Al-Qaeda, are we talking about indigenous members of Al-Qaeda, Iraqis who've been living there, or are we talking primarily about people from the outside?
We actually designate, we say Al-Qaeda Iraq, because Al-Qaeda is in many places, but there are homegrown Al-Qaeda insurgents that are Iraqi and actually join Al-Qaeda. We also have foreigners that are not Iraqis that come from outside who are part of Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq is not just Iraqis. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a mixture of both people who are coming across the border to support Al-Qaeda and also people who they have recruited within Iraq.
An additional question, because I keep in mind that on this broadcast some time ago, when you were still an active duty officer in the Marines, we had a picture of you with stacks of money.
Yes.
And you were providing what I'll call financial assistance
absolutely
to the sheikhs. How big a factor was the dollar in getting the sheikhs to go our way?
Oh, it's enormous. I mean, listen, there's a lot of people say, how can you work with people who, were planting IEDs and blowing, fellow Americans up 2 weeks before and now they're on your side. I mean, I think any American out there who's human will realize when they look at their 2-year-old or their 5-year-old that if they're starving and they're sick, they will do what they need to do to get food into that child's mouth. The sheikhs are very worried about losing any of their influence over their people because they're unable to provide employment. So I think one of our biggest fights with the militia, which we're winning right now with the dollar, is providing young males an opportunity to do something besides join the militia. I mean, if you look at the group that the insurgents target to recruit from, they are largely unemployed males. And that may be saying, oh, hey, Dan, do you want to plant an IED for $100? Well, you live with your whole family and they are living on rice and they haven't had anything. So it may not be that you hate America. It may be that you're trying to survive. So I absolutely think the dollar is huge. And if we do not get jobs started pretty quickly, I mean, what I was doing was a short-term fix. It was like a bridge loan, if you will, saying, okay, I'm buying time here for the United States.
And so that's what you were doing when you dealt out the dollars.
Right. I'm providing employment that otherwise wouldn't exist. I'm giving a short-term opportunity here, waiting for us to try to figure out how to start an economy, how to create some jobs. I mean, it's an enormous task, and so that's why people in a Marine uniform are trying to figure out ways to fight the insurgents, and sometimes it's not just with bullets.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard for Americans to appreciate just the level of poverty and unemployment in Iraq. I mean, we worry with the declining economy about employment going from 5 to 7%. There are parts of Iraq where we're not quite sure if the unemployment is 50% or 70%. It's just devastating. And so it's not like we're handing out money to pay people off and they're going to buy a new TV set or a satellite dish. I mean, these tribal sheikhs are using this money to employ people in their tribe who, in many cases, haven't had jobs for years.
Right. Seth and I were going house to house at one point, and I mean, it's just like horrible because every house you went into, you start interviewing people and you're trying to gather what we call atmospherics, what's going on in the neighborhood, how susceptible are they to being recruited by the militias, and what we continually found was, do you have a job? No. How long has it been since you've had a job? 4 years, 5 years. How are you living? So I mean, it's a very critical situation, and I guess to this day it continues to amaze me that with our sort of economic power and prowess, we have not been able to do a better job of kickstarting an economy in a country where there's enough arable land to feed the people. They have access to the water for cheap transportation of goods. And actually the education level is probably far above many underdeveloped countries that you would go to. So I think the fundamentals are there. But for some reason, people have not focused on this war in the way that they probably should be focusing on it.
We'll take a break, but continue our discussion right after this. So stay here with us. Welcome back to our discussion about the reality of Iraq as opposed to some of the perceptions. I want to talk about the surge. Was there or was there not any talk among troops on the ground, soldiers and Marines, about, well, thank God there's any more troops, thank God they're escalating, or was the surge automatically accepted as the word?
I have never, to this day, been to a place in Iraq, at least out in the field, where there are too many troops. I think we have never had enough troops in Iraq.
Except the green
and
zone.
Except the green
Yeah,
zone.
about the bases,
Except
drinking coffee.
the big bases, right. But any place where they're actually doing the war fighting, we have never had enough troops, and that's been true from the first day of the invasion, and I think it's still true today. But when I heard that we were going to send 20,000 troops over in the additional troops in the surge, my first impression was just that that's a drop in the bucket, and it's simply not going to make a difference. And what I underestimated was the capacity of General Petraeus himself to not only take these 20,000 troops, but totally change the way all the troops, 160,000 troops, were fighting the war.
That's a very important point. We sent an additional 20,000 troops. You say, well, welcome, you'd like to have had more, but that was paired with reforming the way the war was being fought.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the funny thing is that it wasn't like this was a completely new concept. I mean, people knew that these counterinsurgency techniques were what we should be doing, but there was a certain sense, I think, in Iraq in 2005 and especially in 2006 to simply not face up to the reality that the war was not going in our favor, and that what we were doing, our strategy to that point, was not working. So it really took some strong leadership from the top, in this case in the form of General Petraeus, to number one, admit that things were not going well and that we had to change what we were doing. That was the biggest step. And then two, say, hey, we're all going to get on board and we're going to fight this like a counterinsurgency.
It's not a small thing that we had a leader, like you said, that took, honestly, an amount of troops that most of us thought was a drop in the bucket. And it had an exponential effect because he had the guts to say, at a time when the war is not going well, I'm going to take even more casualties and make this strategy work. This is what makes great leaders. They're willing to step up and say, all right, I'm not succumbing to the pressure that's around me, but I'm actually going to make a bold move because we need to stay the course here, but we need to do it in the right way.
And don't stick with a losing game.
Right. And like Seth said, I mean, he came out and said the window's almost shut here. You know, we have this much of a chance of opening that again.
This is General Petraeus.
Right. We nearly lost the war in 2006. And now I think it's a winnable war. I mean, there's many things we need to change, but I think it's winnable. And he realized that the key to winning the fight at that time was to protect the population. You know, if you look at Central Park, I mean, and this may be something that people can relate to. Imagine if the militia was running around the West Side and Wall Street and the East Side, and you're a New Yorker. And you have Marines on the streets. They're supposed to protect you. They're fighting on behalf of you. But actually, they go and they establish a big base in Central Park. And they go back there at night. And the militia controls the streets, and they come into your house. They rape your women when they want. They might kill your children if they don't agree to participate in insurgent activities. And it doesn't take too long for fear to completely control people. If you remember what happened to the United States when we had a couple of snipers in Washington, D.C., it shut us down. So you can imagine when you have militia roaming into houses, nobody wants to put their head up. General Petraeus said, get out of Central Park. Go into all the neighborhoods in New York and protect the people. And we started to win the people's hearts and mind, and it started to give us some space to think about what we needed to do next.
I think it's fascinating. If you were to just look at General Petraeus's press conferences or his briefings to Congress and just what he says, you would think that under General Petraeus the war is going more poorly than it was going for some of his predecessors, and it's just because he's being honest. Because he's not afraid to say, this is a tough fight, but I'm going to be honest with you about how it's going.
Lucian, let me ask you, and you get around and talk to the captains and sergeants who are actually the people in the front to fight the war. Did they ever say to you, as some of their counterparts during the Vietnam War said to me and other journalists on a given occasion, Let me tell you one thing, I think we're getting the hell kicked out of us here.
Yeah, 2005, 2006, early 2007. Nobody was ever particularly timid about telling me that this is screwed up and we should get out of here. Like I said, I did some work with a medical unit in Ramadi, sort of a MASH unit, and I was standing in an area where they were bringing in the casualties, and there was a company First Art guy who's, probably in his late 30s, been in for 15 years or something, and they're bringing these soldiers in, to his unit, and he just sort of turned to me and said, I don't know what we're doing here. Like, whatever it is we're doing, it's not worth this. And that, like I said, that was in sort of late 2006, some of the darkest days of that conflict. And I, personally, my feeling in the beginning was, this is not something we should be doing, but now that we're here, we should fix it. But in the, the months when I was with that unit and talking to those guys, I fully agreed with them that this is, no matter what's coming out of here, it's not going to be good, and it's not worth this sort of sacrifice.
And yet that's not what the leadership at the time was telling the American public, or telling us, for that matter. That's not what our leadership was telling us about how the war was going. And so I don't think we really stood a chance back then of turning anything around if we couldn't simply be honest with ourselves about how it was going.
You didn't think you were being leveled with?
No, I don't think so. Not by the senior leadership, at least. I mean, look, the facts on the ground were just plainly different than the press briefings in Washington and at the Pentagon. And I mean, I'm just being candid and honest to say that.
Let me pause for a second and ask a question I've been aching to ask. Let's start with you, Gilroy. What is the biggest difference between the reality of Iraq and what many, if not most, Americans perceive the reality to be?
Oof, that's a tough question. And the reason I say it's a tough question is because I think there are so many perceptions that don't match the reality in Iraq for Americans, and not because they're naive or because they're ignorant, but because the communication about the war has been not good, and because so few people in the government, in the Congress, understand the war, that it's been very difficult to communicate to them. Anytime I'm on a train or a bus or a plane and we get into conversation, there's a strong thirst for information from the American people. What's going on? We know we're not hearing the true story, but what's going on? And when you hear that repeatedly across the nation, in all different places, from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, you begin to realize that the very nation that's fighting this war doesn't understand it, and now does not understand why we're still there. And that's a very big problem. So I think my biggest concern about Iraq is that Americans think of it as a one-country fight. Right. And so they think that, okay, if we don't fix Iraq and we leave, that's it. It goes away. And they don't actually think of it as a fight that will actually affect the global threat of terrorism.
And that's the problem. I mean, Iraq, despite what we were told, never had anything to do with September 11th. It really didn't have anything to do with terrorism at all. But in a sense, now it does. So for all the wrong reasons that we went there, there are a lot of right reasons, including many connected to things like September 11th, why we should stay. In fact, Afghanistan has always been the good war. Afghanistan was the war we should have fought. It was the war that we started to lose because we diverted resources to Iraq, the bad war, and that's absolutely true. There's no question, again, despite what we were told, that resources were being diverted from Afghanistan to Iraq. And yet the reality today is that, in a sense, we're really in both places for the same reason. We're not why we got there, but we stay there because we're filling a vacuum that otherwise would be filled by regimes or groups hostile to America and its vital interests.
I actually have one more thought, which I feel like I actually owe to the Iraqi people. I mean, it's actually very important to me. And I do want to say that I think they're very misunderstood. And there's many times I'm at a bar or I'm at work, and in the corner somebody will say, oh, you're a Marine, you went over there, you did 3 tours. Yeah, we should just nuke that place. They have this perception that the Iraqis are evil people, that they are somehow all against the Americans, they turn their backs on us, they blow us up. And the troops on the ground can recognize the differences. And I think the Americans need to understand that there are so many times you receive thank yous. There are so many times I have received Christmas cards. There's a great deal of appreciation by the Iraqi people for the American service members over there. They have held services when Marines have been killed, and I think that Americans never get to hear thank you from the Iraqi people. And you know what? That makes a very big difference when you have a son or daughter or a friend who's been over there constantly, to understand that a large portion of the population deeply appreciates what we've done. It's very important to recognize that, and quite frankly, that's not communicated to the American public either.
Let me ask you, there's a lot of talk about the, quote, hollowing out of the U.S. military that has resulted from these long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which have now gone on longer than World War II. From your perspective, has this happened?
Absolutely.
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 No question in your mind?
No question in my mind. I mean, look, I'm not looking at the statistics. I'm not in personnel and manpower up at the Pentagon, but I'm there, and anecdotally and amongst my friends, amongst my classmates in the Marines, they're just getting out in droves. And the sad part too is that they're not only getting out, but then they're really feeling like when they get called back out of the reserves, it's just a backdoor draft. And so the very people that were willing to volunteer, I mean, some of America's best patriots, are the ones who are getting a sour taste in their mouth about the U.S. government because of this war.
Let's talk about the Sunni-Shia civil war and its aftermath. First of all, civil war is fair, as a way of describing it, or not?
I would say...
It depends on what your definition of civil war is. I mean, it was not like a North versus South war like we had in the U.S. in the sense that there were opposing armies. But there was very deep sectarian conflict, and it was certainly headed in the direction that it could be just open fighting between adversaries like that.
But it was I think, a lot sicker than civil war. Imagine if you picked out groups of people to look at their IDs and see, you know, what are they? Are they Sunni Shia? And then you'll go into the hospital and you'll kill them because they're part of the wrong group. So, you know, it's not civil war in that, okay, two sides are going to go fight each other. It was a very selective process, neighborhood by neighborhood, of cleansing. I remember driving back through the neighborhoods in Baghdad when we got there, and I mean, it was really something very different than when, you know, you drive down in Ramadi and it's war-torn and blown up. When you drive through a neighborhood and it's like everybody was there, but there's nobody there. That is how bad 2006 got.
At the time, I think a lot of people wanted to believe that this was still just an insurgency fighting the U.S., and that characterization was totally incorrect. I mean, there was civil conflict, and so in that sense, the bloodbath, the sectarian violence, which was just absolutely heinous, I mean, in a sense, very much was a civil war, as opposed to just an insurgency fighting an occupier. I
don't know if you agree with this, I don't think that the average Sunni in Iraq and the average Shia have a blood hatred for each other. In fact, I don't sense the tension between them that I sense between blacks and whites in America. I mean, the intermarriage rate is, I think, 37%. We have maybe 7% of interracial marriage in America. I think a lot of this was fomented by some pretty nasty insurgent groups that then, once the violence occurred, people started to hate.
It's hard to say, though. I mean, I also know some incredibly well-educated, liberal, progressive Iraqis, the kind of people who you would think would not have problems with sectarian hatred, who are actually who are pretty prejudiced.
Well, could we or could we not have gotten to the stability of the country that it seems to be enjoying now, at whatever level it may be, without the deaths and destruction of thousands of Iraqi civilians?
My feeling is that once a lot of that violence was unleashed, it was going to have to play itself out. And the earlier question about the sort of the separation of the communities in Baghdad, there were definitely places that got a lot more quiet and a lot less violent and a lot easier to manage and to man by the U.S. military after they had killed themselves into separation or fled the country. And you know, I think, like I was saying back about the sheikhs in Ramadi, they didn't get to a place where they finally decided that they needed to find another path until they'd witnessed the deaths of too many of their own family members. And I think that a lot of what has happened has led to some of the positive things as just sort of an exhaustion with all of that.
Alex and I spent some time working in Sawera, which is right on the Sunni-Shia fault line. And it's a hotbed for violence, but especially sectarian violence. And it was only after so many people had gotten killed that they had a tribal awakening. But when they had that tribal awakening, it was a Sunni sheikh and a Shia sheikh who were the top two leaders who joined together to establish the Awakening Council.
I understand. We're going to take another quick break, but when we come back, you'll hear what our distinguished guests think may happen when American soldiers and Marines do finally come home. So stick it in with us. Once again, welcome back to our discussion about Iraq. We were talking about sectarian violence, Sunni versus Shiite violence. Let's talk for at least a second about this man, Sadr. Would it be too strong to describe him as a spent force now?
I think that would be too strong. I think that in some ways the history of the Iraq War in the South of the past few years has been making truces with the guy. We fought him brutally in 2004 in the cemetery and in the old city of Najaf in August, and got very close to the center of his forces around the shrine in the center of the city, and then they said stop, and the fighting just ceased, and we signed some sort of peace deal, and he lived to fight another day.
You think he will fight another day?
I wouldn't be surprised, and I say that just because that's been my experience. I mean, in Sadr City in 2008, we had some very brutal fighting. His forces took some significant losses, and I think were definitely hurt. But at the end of the day, the Iraqi army didn't just go in there and fight to the death and clear everybody out. The leadership went to Iran and they worked out a peace deal, and most of the insurgents just left.
Exclamation point, they went to Iran and worked out a peace deal.
That is, I think, how it happened.
Well, let me shift gears for a moment. We have so much ground I want to cover. We can't possibly cover it all. Let me shift gears for a moment and talk about media coverage. Has the media coverage of the war overall in the main been fair, accurately reflect the realities on the ground, or not? Lucian, let's start with you since you are a member of the press.
I mean, I think there's been a lot of people over there who've done a great job under terrible circumstances, difficult circumstances, and my feeling has always been that if people really wanted to pay attention and really understand what was going on over there, if they applied themselves, that information was out there. That being said, strangely, as things have gotten better in Iraq, the desire to control the media has increased. The better it gets, the more they want to keep the media on message, on their message. And so I think it's kind of ironic that at a point where we're having a presidential campaign, and these are things that should be talked about when information should be flowing freely, it's not, and that people are kind of even more confused. Before it was sort of a military story, you know, we're fighting, we're winning, we're losing, we're dying, we're killing. You know, those things are sort of concrete things. It's not as terribly difficult to understand, but when it gets into complicated backroom Shia political decisions, and you know, and who's paying who, and who in the government is doing what, then it becomes a much more difficult story for people here to understand.
But I think the other problem is that, you know, if I open the New York Times and I read a story about Iraq, most of the facts are there. Most of the facts are right. Not all, but the vast majority, I think, are correct. But it's without the context. So I can read that story and understand where a story about a car bomb fits into the larger context of life in Iraq, or a story about opening a new school. But for the average American who sees very little coverage of the war, it's hard to establish that context. And so even if they have some facts right, their perspective on the war is skewed.
If I read you right, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that the major shortcoming has been in trying to put it in context and give it as full a perspective as possible.
I think that's true, and I think that part of the problem is simply the fact that America is not engaged with this war. I mean, very few Americans have a son or a daughter serving there, and it's not increasing any because we're not drafting more. I mean, it's the same people who are going back again and again. It's like 1% of America that's fighting this war. So if you as an average American don't really have to worry about the war very much, then you're probably not going to make that much of an effort to go out and seek the coverage that would help you understand it.
The media is part of this war, and in this day and age, communicating the war effort to the people is critical. And I'll tell you, as a Marine over there, when Lucian came over, I was nervous because every time you participate with the media, you don't know what's going to come out at home. And you're very worried about being painted in a different light than how you are. And so I think for the soldiers and the Marines on the ground, we're scared of participating with the media a bit because everybody wants to be represented the way they are. And I think there's been some circumstances in the press where people have felt they haven't been represented, and that creates a problem.
Yeah.
Well, let me pause here and say that each of you worked with and for General Petraeus, and it's clear that you have the utmost respect for him. It's also clear that you believe he's earned that on the record. Let me challenge you at least mildly here about General Petraeus, what he's done. There is a growing part of the American public which is pro-General Petraeus, and why wouldn't it be? The casualties for the month of July came in as the lowest casualties we've had, I think, since the war started, or certainly in a very, very long time. But what about this argument? It's an argument made, and I'll paraphrase it, by Senator Obama and his campaign that goes along these lines. Yes, the escalation, the surge worked, along with General Petraeus changing the whole approach to the country. Give him credit, but that this cannot be sustained over the long pull. It can't be sustained in Iraq, and it can't be sustained in Afghanistan.
I think General Petraeus knows that, and I think he knows it as someone in the military, quite frankly, a lot better than someone who's never even served. I think that what he's trying to do is balance that very real concern with the reality that if we pull out too soon, everything we've worked for and the stability that we have achieved will go away. And then we'll have a much bigger problem on our hands than we do now.
We know during the Vietnam War that there came a point, one can argue about where that point was, when they began to be, and it was rapidly accelerated, a pretty big drop-off in the quality of the U.S. fighting forces in Vietnam. Did you get any sense of this?
I think maybe partially what saved us is for all of the guys who've come in, who are not maybe the first grade, you know, not maybe the guys that we want, not maybe the first choice. A lot of the guys who have stayed in have gotten a lot better at it. I mean, I was amazed during my last trip how many lance corporals and specialists and sergeants were walking around speaking Arabic, which, you know, 3 or 4 years ago that never happened. And now you have these guys who are on their third tour or whatever who get it. I mean, that Iraq for them is like their home, you know, so you might as well learn how to speak the language and really sort of understand the people. And I think that's sort of a saving grace for us.
That gives me a segue to ask, where do we go from here? Listen, none of us have a crystal ball. All of us have learned that if you live by the crystal ball, you learn to eat a lot of broken glass. But as best you can make out, where does it go from here? What's the future? What do you hope the future can be?
I guess I'm in favor of getting everybody home as soon as we can do it, given the facts on the ground there. I mean, I don't think that the Iraqis want us there forever. I don't think the idea that we need to have bases there and a continued presence there is the best thing. I guess my feeling for a long time has been it's not really about us, that they're going to make the decisions one way or the other, and I think that they're doing that more and more, perhaps to our relief a little bit. It's going to take some of the responsibility off of us now that if they wake up one day and remember that, hey, it is our country, and in fact we can say, thank you very much, we really appreciate it, but you can probably go on home now.
I think it's not going to be a thriving democracy, not anytime soon. I think that hope realistically has gone away. It's not going to be the kind of democracy that we have here in America by any stretch of the imagination, at least not for a good many decades. But what we can achieve in Iraq is stability, and that's what we need to hold together that incredibly important and fragile portion of the world. And that, I think, is an achievable goal, but we're not there yet. I think it's a very hard goal still, and I think even though there is an awful lot of stability on the ground in Iraq today, it's American soldiers and Marines who are in large part holding it all together.
Ms. Gilroy?
I mean, this is a very tough question because I think that we need to redefine what we're doing there. So sometimes you start things and they end up to be different than what you started with. And right now, I think that the American public is sort of saying, what are we doing there? How long are we going to be there? What's going on? It's not going to be a democracy. But that doesn't mean that it's not critically important to our own security or to the security of many other countries, to include Iraq's neighbors and the Iraqi people. And so we need objectives and we need a redefined end goal from the government. We need them to say, hey, get on TV at night. Democracy is not happening anytime soon. And we're not actually trying to achieve an American democracy there any longer because we'll bankrupt our country and we'll break our military. But this is what we're trying to do. And if we don't stay long enough and we don't use the diplomacy to bring our neighbors into this fight, then we're going to suffer the consequence. You know, whether it's increased threat of terrorism, a natural resource crisis, which we're already seeing the problems of now, or a total meltdown in the Middle East. We can't afford it, Europe can't afford it, and the fact that our economies are now so linked, I mean, we could have a very, very serious crisis. And I think any precipitous withdrawal at this point, it's not about, okay, we just need to admit democracy is not going to work, so let's go home. Okay, well, democracy may be off the table, but as Seth was saying earlier, there are so many other things on the table that deserve some very serious thought. And, you know, America's fragile. We are very fragile right now. And if both senators think that they have a foreign policy that's going to work, then they will be making trips to our neighbors and they will be helping them to explain this war to their population and explain why it is so important. And, you know, if it means moving more troops to Afghanistan or dealing with some of the problems on the borders there, we need to do that. I think we're at a crisis point here. The military is tired. I am tired. Most of the people I talk to are tired. And we need a horizon. We don't want to just grab our packs and run home. We want to know, hey, you know, can you give us 3 more tours? Here's the objectives we're trying to accomplish. This is how we think we're going to accomplish them. Can you sit down with your wife and ask her if she can do it for 3 more years? You know, that's attainable. And for the American public, that's attainable. For our budget, that's attainable. And then you say to Europe, if you can't get your population to send troops, you're going to help us finance this because we will not be a global insurance policy. We cannot afford to be. But we also cannot afford for the lights in this country to go out either. You know, I mean, this is, I really see that this is a pivotal point here, and I actually think the consequence could be enormous, and it has actually nothing to do with creating democracy in Iraq. It is all about the other factors, the natural resource, the global threat of terrorism, their reach, their global reach power. I mean, they took down the World Trade Centers. These are not people who are unable to execute. These are not people who just have scary websites. They are people who are able to bankrupt one of the most powerful countries in the world. And we need to take that threat extremely seriously and not give in to, okay, the population's tired and frustrated. Americans are because they don't know what's going on. And we just need to sit down and redefine it.
You know, there's always been a very small number of right answers or right results to good results for this war. And I think we can probably strike thriving democracy off that list, just to be realistic. But there's still a much, much longer list of wrong results.
Iran.
To this crisis, and wrong answers to the problem of the war in Iraq.
Why did you mention Iran?
The greater impact and influence of Iran this time when we went back was literally in our face. I mean, we're talking about weapons that are pieces of artillery that are larger than what we have. I mean, maybe 7-foot-long rockets hitting us. Those are not homegrown in an Iraqi garage.
You think they're Iranian, Rick?
Yes. I mean, Iran, we know they are. Iran has their fingers in this war more than people can imagine. And so one of our top objectives should be able to figure out how to get them out of the country. How do we maintain the Iranian people's right to their own future and try to quelch this threat of their president and his dangerous behaviors. I mean, I don't think just sitting down and having a cup of tea with Ahmadinejad is going to solve the problem. And I will say, when we leave that territory, it will be extremely difficult. We will have a heck of a fight to get back in there, and nobody should confuse that. And you can't take a broken, tired military and say, all right, now you really got to ramp up, because we just gave up the territory and they've reinforced. It's not going to happen.
You chuckled at one point there.
Well, the American public is, I think, reasonably skeptical when, you know, some people in the administration or whatever get up and say that Iran is a threat, because we've been told other regimes in the past are a threat, and it's quite frankly not been true. But as someone who's seen the intelligence and understands why it unfortunately can't be declassified just because of the ways we get it, unfortunately, it really is true. Iran is a very, very serious threat. They are killing American troops in Iraq as we speak. And they are also, like it or not, the biggest beneficiaries of not just the Iraq War, but the Afghanistan War as well. Because Afghanistan and Iraq are Iran's two historical enemies. Yeah. And we just took care of them.
Yeah.
That prompts me to ask, as things stand now, is the big winner of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War Iran?
Could be.
Very well could be.
Very.
I don't think it's. I don't think it's
Well,
society.
that's kind of above my pay grade as a photographer, but
well, we're near the
sure
end
seems
here.
that way now.
And I wish this could go on forever, and we may take it up at another time, but I want to thank you for being here. But I want to close by asking each of you, at this moment, what do you think is the single most important thing for Americans to know about Iraq?
That it's a winnable war. We need to change some things, but we can do it.
And the definition of win would be what?
Would be to create stability, to reduce the influence of Iran, and to preserve the fact that those natural resources that Iran has, the second largest world oil reserves, remain available to the free market and to the Iraqi people, and not in the hands of some very dangerous regimes.
Question to you, single most important thing for Americans to know about Iraq right now?
That despite all the wrong reasons for going there, there are a lot of right reasons why we have to make it work. And even if that means staying a little longer. And there are a tremendous number of incredibly brave and inspiring young Americans who understand that and are willing to keep going back, and we need to support them in that fight.
And your definition of win would be what?
Is to achieve a regime in Iraq that is a stable ally to the United States and can be a legitimate balancing force against Iran and some of the other regimes in the Middle East that oppose our strategic interests.
Lucian?
Well, I agree with basically everything they said. I guess I would only add, having just come back from Afghanistan, that the important thing to know about Iraq is that it's not the only war. Just because things seem to be going better there doesn't mean we should take our eye off the ball there, but that Afghanistan needs attention yesterday, and that if anything, we need to, put more resources and more thought and more energy and more creativity into both of them.
Your definition of what a win would be in Iraq?
I guess my personal definition of win is an outcome that justifies the death and sacrifice of so many Americans and their families. For me, it's whatever makes them feel like what they did was worthwhile is a win for me. I don't, big political, geopolitical ideas, that doesn't necessarily interest me that much. But I've seen a lot of guys go through a lot of terrible things over there in the last 4 years, and whatever makes them feel like their buddy didn't die for nothing, I'd be happy with that.
I want to thank you all. With that, we'll have to close our discussion tonight. I do want to thank our guests, Ann Gilroy, Georgetown graduate, former Marine captain, Iraq War veteran, Seth Moulton, also a Harvard alum, Marine Reserve captain now, 4 tours in Iraq. Both of you true heroes who represented your country faithfully and honorably, and for that we express our personal appreciation. We thank you for your honesty and openness tonight as well. And our friend Lucian Reed, thank you, a fearless journalist who has spent more than 2 years of his life documenting the war in Iraq. And we'd like to thank you for joining us. We hope we've shed at least some light, perhaps some tiny new perspective, maybe a tiny new sunburst of thought about such a complicated situation from Americans who have actually walked the walk. For HDNet, from New York, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.